You are standing in the middle of a brightly lit aisle at a big box store, staring at a wall of 40 different types of pacifiers. You are agonizing over whether medical-grade silicone is superior to natural latex, or if the orthodontic shape actually prevents a crossbite 3 years down the line. It feels like a high-stakes, life-defining choice. But if you were standing in the exact same spot 50,000 years ago, that choice wouldn't exist. Your primary concern wouldn't be the shape of a piece of plastic. It would be whether you could keep a 3-kilogram human being quiet enough so a leopard didn't hear it, or if you had enough fat on your own ribs to produce milk for another week. The paradox of ancient parenthood is that it was both more terrifyingly fragile and more socially robust than anything we experience today. We live in an era of maximum safety and maximum isolation, while our ancestors lived in an era of maximum danger and maximum connection. The way they welcomed a baby into the world wasn't just a series of survival tactics, it was the very thing that forced us to become human. Everything you've been told about the natural ease of ancient birth is likely a romanticized fabrication. You might imagine a mother retreating to a quiet stream, giving birth with the grace of a gazelle, and walking back to camp with a baby on her hip an hour later. That almost never happened. In fact, if a human mother tried to give birth the way a chimpanzee or a horse does, entirely alone and unassisted, she would face a significantly higher risk of death than almost any other mammal on the planet. This is the first great mystery of our species. Why did evolution make the most important biological event of our lives so incredibly difficult? For decades, the leading explanation was the obstetrical dilemma. The idea was that as we started walking on 2 legs, our pelvises got narrower to handle the mechanical stress of bipedalism, while our brains got bigger. This created a tight squeeze that made birth a life-or-death struggle. However, if you think it's just a matter of big head, small hole, recent science says you're missing the real story. In 2011, Dr. Holly Dunsworth at the University of Rhode Island challenged this classic pelvic width theory. Her research suggests that the timing of human birth isn't dictated by the size of the pelvis alone, but by the mother's metabolism. A human fetus is so energy-intensive that by 9 months, the mother's body simply cannot provide enough calories to keep the baby inside any longer. We give birth when the mother reaches her metabolic limit. This means human babies are born early compared to other primates. A baby chimp can cling to its mother almost immediately. A baby human is essentially a 4th trimester fetus living on the outside. This biological failure is actually our greatest evolutionary hack. Because we are born so helpless, we are also incredibly plastic and social. But that social nature started with the birth itself. Unlike almost every other primate, human mothers are biologically and psychologically primed to seek help during labor. But while the physical mechanics of labor were a universal hurdle, the way our ancestors handled the immediate aftermath would look utterly alien to a modern hospital staff. Today, we focus on sterile environments, plastic bassinets, and timed feedings. In the Pleistocene, the environment was the mother. For 99% of our history, there was no such thing as putting the baby down. Researchers like Dr. Wenda Trevathan have pointed out that ancient babies were in physical contact with another human being for nearly 24 hours a day. In hunter-gatherer societies like the Kung of the Kalahari or the Hadza of Tanzania, babies are carried in slings, skin to skin, against the mother's chest or hip. This wasn't because they were overly indulgent, it was a matter of thermal regulation. A newborn cannot maintain its own body temperature. Without a synthetic blanket or a climate-controlled nursery, the mother's chest served as the baby's thermostat. If the baby got too cold, the mother's skin temperature would actually rise to compensate. This constant contact created a feedback loop of hormones, specifically oxytocin, that bonded the mother and child so tightly that the two were, for all intents and purposes, a single organism for the first year of life. None of that mattered, though, if the mother was exhausted or malnourished, which brings us to the next contradiction. You might assume the primary caregiver was always the mother, but the survival of an ancient baby actually depended on a cast of characters we've largely sidelined in the modern West. Enter the grandmother hypothesis. This is one of the most powerful theories in evolutionary biology, championed by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes. Most animals reproduce until they die. Humans, however, have a strange biological quirk, menopause. We are one of the only species on Earth where females live for decades after they can no longer have children. Why would evolution allow a non-reproductive individual to consume resources? The answer is found in the dirt. Hawks studied the Hadza people and found that grandmothers were the most productive foragers in the tribe. While young mothers were tied down by nursing infants, the grandmothers were digging up tubers and gathering fruit to feed the entire family. A baby with an active, healthy grandmother had a vastly higher chance of surviving past age 5. The grandmother wasn't just a babysitter, she was the evolutionary engine that allowed the human population to explode. But if you think the help stopped with family, the reality was even more communal. In many ancient societies, the concept of exclusive breastfeeding didn't exist. This is a concept called alamothering or othermothering, extensively documented by the legendary Sarah Blaffer H. Ardoi. In the F tribe of the Ituri forest, a newborn is passed around to half a dozen different women within the first few hours of its life. These women will hold the baby, soothe it, and in some cases, even nurse it if the mother is recovering from a difficult birth. This created a distributed parenting model. By the time a child in these societies was 3 years old, they had been held and cared for by dozens of people. This didn't confuse the child. It made them incredibly resilient. It also explains one of the most frustrating aspects of modern parenting, the crying. We often think of colicky, screaming infants as an unavoidable part of babyhood, but research suggests this might be a modern cultural artifact. In the 1980s and 90s, developmental pediatrician Ronald Barr conducted fascinating studies comparing Western infants with those of the Kung San. He found that Kung babies cried just as often as Western babies, but their crying bouts lasted only seconds. Because the response was instantaneous. In a hunter-gatherer camp, the distance between a baby and a set of warm arms is 0. If a baby fusses, it is picked up, offered a breast, or bounced immediately. There is no crying it out. There is no nursery at the end of the hall. The baby's nervous system never has to escalate to a full-blown, purple-face scream because its needs are met before the cortisol levels can spike. We have spent the last 100 years trying to train babies to be independent, but their 50,000-year-old brains are still expecting a level of responsiveness that we struggle to provide in our isolated, 2-bedroom apartments. Everything I've just described suggests a world of warmth and tribal support, but there was a much darker side to ancient infancy that we rarely talk about. This is where the sentimental view of the past hits a brutal wall of reality. Because resources were so scarce and the environment so unforgiving, ancient parents had to make choices that would be considered unthinkable today. In many hunter-gatherer and early nomadic societies, a baby wasn't considered a person the moment they were born. Infant mortality was so high, estimated at 30 to 50% before age 15, that many cultures practiced a form of emotional hedging. They didn't name the baby for weeks or even months. Among some Arctic groups, a child wasn't named until they showed their first smile, as if the child had to prove they were staying before the family invested in them emotionally. This brings us to the uncomfortable reality of selective investment. If a mother had a toddler who was still nursing and she gave birth to a new baby, she faced a horrific calculation. If she tried to raise both, she might lose both to malnutrition. In some instances, ancient humans practiced infanticide or abandoned infants who were born with visible defects or during times of extreme famine. This wasn't out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, cold-blooded necessity to preserve the life of the existing children who had already made it past the most dangerous window of infancy. We see the echoes of this in the archaeological record, where infant burials are often separate from the rest of the tribe, or where the grave goods associated with babies are minimal. The ancient world was a place of deep love, but it was also a place where love was a luxury that had to be balanced against the survival of the group. But if a baby did survive those first few precarious months, the way they were anchored to the world was through ritual, and nothing was more important than the treatment of the placenta. While we treat the placenta as medical waste today, ancient humans saw it as a spiritual twin. The Navajo tradition of burying the placenta within the family's land wasn't just about hygiene, it was a physical way to tether the child to the earth. In some Indonesian cultures, the placenta was cleaned, dressed, and given its own burial in a small urn, treated with the same respect as a deceased relative. This ritualized the transition from the womb to the world. It was an acknowledgement that the mother and child had shared a literal, physical bond that was now being transformed into a social one. These rituals were the first education for the tribe, a signal that a new life had been successfully integrated into the collective. Contrary to the idea that ancient life was a lawless free-for-all, the rules around breastfeeding were incredibly strict and lasted for years, not months. The average weaning age for most of human history was between 3 and 4 years old. This was nature's primary form of birth control. Frequent, on-demand breastfeeding suppresses ovulation, which naturally spaced out children by several years. This ensured that each child had the full attention and resources of the mother during those critical early years. It also meant that ancient toddlers were getting high-quality antibodies and nutrition long after they started eating solid food. When you look at the skeletal remains of ancient children, you often see a stress line in the teeth that marks the moment they were finally weaned. It was the hardest transition of their lives, moving from the constant safety of the mother's milk to the unpredictable diet of the tribe. You might think that once the child was weaned and walking, they were finally free to be kids, but the very concept of childhood is a remarkably recent invention. In the ancient world, there was no sharp divide between the world of children and the world of adults. Babies and toddlers were present for everything. They were there for the butchering of animals, the fabrication of tools, the rituals of death, and the politics of the camp. There were no kid-friendly versions of reality. Anthropologists like David Lancy have noted that ancient children learned through autonomous play and observation, not through direct instruction. A 4-year-old might be given a small, blunt version of a digging stick or a bow and told to play, but that play was a direct imitation of the survival skills they would need in just a few years. By the age of 7 or 8, these children were often contributing significantly to the tribe's caloric intake. They weren't being raised in the sense of being molded, they were being absorbed into the adult world as quickly as their bodies would allow. But if you look closely at the data, the most startling difference between their world and ours isn't the physical danger, it's the psychological landscape. We have replaced the tribe with experts. Instead of a grandmother who has seen 100 births, we have a search engine. Instead of a sister who can take the baby while we sleep, we have a sound machine that mimics the white noise of a womb. We have successfully automated the care, while accidentally deleting the connection. This has led to what some researchers call a mismatch between our evolutionary expectations and our modern reality. Our babies are born with a biological blueprint that expects a group of 14 caregivers, constant skin contact, and a village of peers to play with. When they instead find themselves in a quiet, sterile room with a single, stressed-out parent, their nervous systems can go into a state of low-level threat. None of this is to say that we should go back to the Pleistocene. The modern drop in infant mortality is arguably the single greatest achievement of our species. The fact that you don't have to worry about a minor fever killing your child in 3 days is a miracle that our ancestors would have traded their entire world for. But in our quest to eliminate the danger, we have also thinned out the support. We have made birth a private medical event rather than a communal triumph. We have turned parenting into a solitary performance, where we feel judged by the brand of stroller we buy, rather than supported by the hands that help us carry the load. However, the reality of our biology is that we haven't actually changed. A baby born in 2024 is, genetically speaking, the same baby that was born in a cave 40,000 years ago. Their brain is still scanning the environment for the smell of a tribe, for the sound of multiple voices, and for the feeling of being held until they are old enough to run. We see this in the way we still instinctively rock a baby. Why do we do that? Because for hundreds of thousands of years, a baby was only safe when its mother was moving, walking to a new camp, gathering food, or fleeing danger. Silence and stillness meant abandonment. Motion meant safety. Even today, in your climate-controlled house, your baby's amygdala is still checking to see if the tribe is on the move. But if we want to understand the true legacy of ancient parenthood, we have to look at the one thing that has survived every transition from the savannah to the city: The first smile ritual. Almost every culture on Earth has a special reaction to that moment, usually around 6 to 8 weeks, when a baby looks at a face and smiles back. In the ancient world, this was the moment of social birth. It was the signal that the fourth trimester was over and the child was now a participating member of the community. It was the baby's way of saying, "I am here, and I recognize you." That smile is a piece of ancient technology, a social hook designed to make the tribe fall in love with a helpless creature that can't yet contribute anything but hope. Everything about the way we were born and raised for the first 200,000 years of our existence was designed to ensure that no one person ever had to do it alone. The obstetrical dilemma forced us to seek help during labor. The metabolic limit forced us to give birth to helpless infants who required constant care. The grandmother hypothesis ensured that we had a built-in support system of elders. And the Alamothering model meant that every child belonged to the group, not just the individual. We are a species that was literally built by the act of caring for infants. Our large brains, our complex language, and our deep empathy all began as tools to better understand and protect the most vulnerable members of our tribe. But here is the final, haunting realization. We live in a world where we have more information about baby care than ever before, yet we feel more incompetent than any generation in history. We have the perfect pacifier, the perfect nursery, and the perfect medical care. Yet, there is a hollow feeling in modern parenting that no amount of technology can fill. It's the feeling of missing the 13 other pairs of arms that were supposed to be there. It's the feeling of a grandmother who lives 3 states away instead of 3 feet away. We have traded the village for the vibe, and our nervous systems know the difference. If you want the most definitive proof of this, you don't have to look at ancient bones or peer-reviewed studies. You just have to look at the way you instinctively hold a baby. When you pick up a crying infant, you don't stand still. You bounce. You hum. You pace the floor. You are performing a ritual that is older than the English language, older than agriculture, and older than the concept of a family. You are trying to convince that baby that the tribe is still moving, that the fire is still burning, and that someone is still watching the horizon. You are the latest link in a chain of millions of parents who did exactly the same thing, often in the dark and often in fear. The next time you're in that grocery store aisle, paralyzed by the choice between 2 different types of diapers, remember that your ancestors didn't have choices. They only had each other. They didn't have a manual, but they had a million years of hard-coded instinct. They knew that a baby wasn't a project to be completed or a puzzle to be solved. A baby was a guest who had to be invited into the world by a whole community of people who were willing to share their warmth, their food, and their lives. We have gained the world and lost the village, and the hardest part of being a modern human is trying to be a whole village for a baby that was never meant to be raised by just 1 or 2 people. Which brings us back to that small, seemingly insignificant detail mentioned earlier, the stone flake. We think of ancient technology as primitive, as a sign of how far we've come. But imagine the absolute, unwavering precision required to use a sharp piece of flint to cut the umbilical cord of your own child by the light of a flickering fire. There was no room for error. There were no antibiotics if it went wrong. That stone flake is the definitive, haunting proof of how high the stakes were. Every single one of your ancestors survived that moment. Every single person in your direct lineage was held by someone who managed to navigate that fragility without the help of a modern hospital. You are the result of a 50,000-year winning streak. The ancient world didn't have organic wipes or ergonomic strollers, but it had a social safety net made of human skin and collective willpower. You were never meant to do this alone, and the fact that you feel like you're struggling isn't a sign of your failure. It's just your 50,000-year-old brain noticing that the rest of the tribe is missing. If this deep dive into our collective past changed how you look at the stress of modern parenting, or if you have a story about the village that helped you, tell us about it in the comments. We genuinely want to hear those real-world connections. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden biological history of being human, consider subscribing. It helps us keep these stories coming. We're all still just trying to figure out the world, one heartbeat at a time.